Welcome to the Explainer. All right, today we are going to create a visual map, a real walkthrough of the super complex world of hematology. We're going to look at everything from how our blood stays in this perfect, delicate balance to the absolute chaos that happens when that balance gets thrown off. So here's the plan. We're going to start with that delicate balance I mentioned. Then we'll dive deep into the domino effect, the cascade of events and things like anemia and leukemia. We'll even tackle those really weird clotting disorders. And stick around because at the end, we'll pull it all together into a super clear summary, perfect for visualizing this stuff for your exams. Okay, so before we jump in, let's just make sure we're all on the same page about one key term, pathophysiology. Look, it's not just some fancy word for naming a disease. It's really about understanding the why. It's the step-by-step story of how one tiny change inside the body kicks off the next one, and the next one, all the way from what's happening at a cellular level to the actual symptoms a person feels. It's the how it happens part of the story. All right, let's talk about blood's delicate balance. Think of your blood as this incredibly fine-tuned ecosystem. Its entire health hinges on this constant balancing act between three key players. You've got your red blood cells, they're the oxygen delivery trucks. Then you have your white blood cells, which are like the security guards defending against invaders. And finally, the platelets. They're the emergency repair crew, handling all the clotting to stop leaks.
So what happens when that perfect balance gets totally messed up? Well, the whole system can crash in a few different ways. You might not have enough of something, like not enough oxygen trucks and anemia, or you could have a total hostile takeover from way too much production, which is what we see in leukemia. And then there's just complete paradoxical chaos, where the system pretty much turns on itself. So let's dive into our first example and see exactly how this all plays out.
Okay, first up, red cells. We're going to start with those oxygen carriers, the erythrocytes, or red blood cells. We're going to trace the whole cascade of events that leads to a really common condition, anemia. Now, I know this flowchart might look a little intimidating at first glance, but it actually makes understanding anemia so much simpler. What it shows us is that anemia isn't really just one single disease. It's the end result of one of three main problems. Either you're losing blood, you're not making enough red blood cells in the first place, or you're destroying them way too fast. That's it. Every single type of anemia you can think of falls into one of those buckets. And here's the most important takeaway from that. It doesn't matter which of those three paths we're talking about. The fundamental problem, the core issue in any type of anemia, is exactly the same. Your blood just can't carry enough oxygen to your body's tissues. That right there, that's the central event we've got to lock in.
So let's visualize the step-by-step progression, right? It always starts with some kind of trigger. Maybe it's acute blood loss from a major injury, or maybe it's something like a vitamin deficiency that just slams the brakes on red cell production. Whatever that trigger is, it leads directly to that core problem we just talked about, a big drop in oxygen carrying capacity. And that results in something called tissue hypoxia, which, is a fancy way of saying your cells are literally starving for oxygen.
But here's the thing. Your body doesn't just sit back and take it. No way. It's a fighter. The second it senses that oxygen deficit, it kicks into high gear to try and compensate. The heart starts pounding faster, pushing more blood with every single pump. You start breathing faster, deeper. Your whole cardiovascular system goes into this hyperdynamic state, just trying to make the absolute most of whatever oxygen is left.
And this is where you can see the direct line from the internal process to what a person actually feels. That classic fatigue and weakness? That's the body working in overdrive, just burning fuel for less and less oxygen. That shortness of breath? That's the compensation mechanism we just talked about. Even the pale skin makes perfect sense. It's just a result of less of that red hemoglobin circulating near the skin's surface. See? Every single symptom is a logical endpoint of this internal cascade. We can also get clues about anemia just by looking at the red blood cells themselves. For example, macrocytic cells are these big, goofy-looking, abnormally large cells. That often points to a vitamin B12 or folate deficiency because those are needed for proper DNA synthesis. Then you have the opposite, microcytic and hypochromic cells. These guys are tiny and pale, and that's a dead giveaway, a classic sign of iron deficiency. There's just isn't enough iron to build a normal-sized, richly colored hemoglobin-packed cell. All right, let's switch gears. We're moving from the oxygen carriers to the body's security force, the white blood cells, or leukocytes. Now, with leukemia, we're not talking about a shortage. Oh no. We're talking about a full-blown hostile takeover, where the system gets flooded with a massive army of bad, dysfunctional cells. The two words you absolutely have to remember here are uncontrolled and immature. What happens in leukemia is the bone marrow, which is like the body's blood cell factory, just goes haywire. It starts pumping out these immature white blood cells called blasts, and I mean massive numbers of them. The problem is, these blasts are completely useless. They're abnormal, they can't do their job, and they multiply so fast that they literally take over the factory, crowding out any chance for normal, healthy red cells, white cells, or platelets to get made. So you have to wonder, how on earth do these cancerous cells get so powerful? Well, it turns out they are absolute masters of manipulation. This diagram here, it's like we've gotten our hands on their secret playbook. It shows exactly how acute myeloid leukemia, or AML cells, don't just exist. They actively reshape their own little world to make sure they survive and thrive. Let's break down their game plan.
The really critical thing to get here is that these cells are anything but passive. They're strategic. First, they literally latch onto other cells in the bone marrow to hide from chemotherapy. It's like a cloaking device. Then, they send out signals to grow their own private blood supply, that's angiogenesis. They even hijack their own internal wiring to turn off the self-destruct command, basically making themselves immortal. And to top it all off, they talk to other cells to hit the gas on their own replication. They don't just live in the bone marrow, they conquer it. It's a total hostile takeover. Okay, on to our final topic. And honestly, this might be the most mind-bending, paradoxical concept in all of hematology. We're going to look at the clotting system. Because when this system goes wrong, it can go so wrong that the body starts doing two opposite things at once. It starts clotting like crazy and bleeding uncontrollably at the exact same time. I know, that sounds totally impossible, right? How can you bleed and clot at the same time? But getting your head around that paradox is absolutely essential to understanding a really dangerous condition called disseminated intravascular coagulation, or DIC for short. The name itself actually tells you a lot of the story. Disseminated just means it's widespread, happening everywhere. Intravascular means it's inside the blood vessels, and coagulation, well, that's clotting. So the best way to picture DIC is to imagine the on switch for your body's entire clotting system gets stuck. It's just jammed on, running completely out of control all throughout your body. So here's part one of the paradox, the clotting. It starts with some kind of massive trigger. We're talking major stuff like sepsis or severe trauma. This is what flips that on switch. And suddenly, thousands and thousands of tiny little clots start forming in small blood vessels all over the body. These tiny clots block blood flow, and that starves organs and tissues of oxygen, causing widespread damage. And here it is. Here's the paradox. While the body is going crazy, making all these tiny clots, it's using up, consuming, all of its platelets and clotting factors. It's burning through the entire supply of materials you need to stop real bleeding. So then, when a genuine bleed happens somewhere, the warehouse is empty. There's nothing left in the tank to form a proper clot. And the result is catastrophic, uncontrolled bleeding. The clotting literally causes the bleeding. It's wild. Okay, wow. So we have walked through three really different, really complex pathways. Let's pull all this together now. We're going to consolidate everything into one clear, high-yield summary. Think of it as your visual map to help you trace these steps in your head when you need to.
And here you go, the whole story on one slide. So for anemia, I want you to visualize that chain reaction. Trigger leads to hypoxia, which leads to compensation, which leads to the symptoms. For leukemia, picture that cancer cell with its survival playbook, actively rigging the game in its favor. And for DIC, just remember that single powerful idea, the consumption paradox. The runaway clotting consumes all the supplies, and that's what causes the bleeding.
You know, this quote here really brings it all home. It talks about how all these different parts, the lining of your vessels, the platelets, the clotting factors, are all designed to work together in this perfect, beautiful harmony. And really, that's what pathophysiology is all about, right? It's the story of what happens when that harmony is completely shattered.
So we've looked at what happens when production goes down, and what happens when clotting goes into crazy overdrive. But it leaves you with a question, doesn't it? What happens when the body's own defense system, the very system designed to protect us, goes rogue and becomes the attacker, turning against its own healthy cells? Well, that's a whole other story for another time.